If you've ever stood in a room that used to belong to someone you loved and felt like a complete stranger in it, then you already know exactly how Ruth Calloway felt the morning she unlocked the door to her mother's tailor shop for the last time. She didn't go inside right away. She just stood there on the sidewalk in Millhaven, Tennessee, holding a ring of keys that didn't belong to her yet, looking at the hand-painted sign above the door. Norma's alterations and fine tailoring. The paint was peeling at the corners. Her mother had been meaning to touch it up for 3 years. Now nobody would. Before we go any further, if you're new here, welcome to Giant Stories. We tell the kind of stories that remind you what people are really made of. Hit that subscribe button and stay with us, because what Ruth found inside that shop is something none of us saw coming. Not even her. Ruth was 53 years old, and by almost every measure that the world uses to judge a woman, she was starting over from zero. The divorce had been finalized 14 months before her mother, Norma Jean Calloway, passed away in her sleep on a Thursday in late October. 14 months. That's not enough time to grieve one thing before another one arrives. Ruth had sold the house she and her ex-husband Dennis had shared for 22 years. Moved into a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on Clement Street, and was working 3 days a week at a dental office answering phones, a job she was grateful for and secretly embarrassed about in equal measure. She had a daughter, Becca, who lived in Phoenix and called every Sunday. She had a brother, Gary, who lived 40 minutes away in Clarksburg and showed up to the funeral in sunglasses and left before the reception ended. And she had past tense, a mother who ran a small tailoring shop out of a converted storefront on Abernathy Road for 31 years and never once complained about her feet. Even when they hurt so bad, she had to soak them in Epsom salt every night before bed. That was Norma. Ruth had not gone to the shop in the 2 weeks since the funeral. She told herself she wasn't ready. What she meant was she was afraid of what ready felt like. That specific quiet that comes after someone is gone, and the world just keeps moving, and at some point, you have to go sort through their things, and that's when it becomes real in a way it wasn't before. But the lease on the shop was paid through the end of November, and it was November 3rd. So Ruth drove to Millhaven on a Tuesday morning, parked her car in the same spot she'd parked it 100 times growing up, and stood outside on the sidewalk holding a ring of keys. She went inside. The shop smelled like her mother. That's the first fabric softener and the faint ghost of Chanel No. 5. And something older underneath all of it, the smell of the wood itself, decades of thread and chalk, and the warm metal of the old steam iron that sat on its rest beside the main work table. Ruth stood just inside the door and breathed it in and didn't say a word to herself or anyone. The shop was narrow and deep. Display racks along the left wall held bolts of fabric, crepe muslin, a deep burgundy velvet that Norma had bought last spring for a client's mother-of-the-bride dress and never fully used up. Straight pins in a tomato-shaped cushion on the counter. A bulletin board above the register covered in photos and Christmas cards, and one handwritten note in a child's handwriting that said, "Thank you for making my dress perfect, Mrs. Norma." Ruth didn't know who that was from. She had never thought to ask. She started the way you start with any impossible task. She picked up one thing and put it in a box, then another, then another. By noon, she had filled 4 boxes with fabric scraps, notions, spools of thread organized by color, and her mother's collection of fashion magazines going back to 1987. By 2 o'clock, she had disassembled the dress form and wrapped it in moving blankets. By 4, she was in the back storage room, which her mother had always called the workroom, surrounded by a lifetime of careful order. Everything labeled, everything placed with intention, and she sat down on an overturned milk crate and let herself cry for about 4 minutes. Then she wiped her face and kept going. That's what Ruth did. She kept going. She'd been doing it for 53 years. It was almost 5 o'clock when she moved the old cedar wardrobe. The wardrobe had been in the back corner of the workroom for as long as Ruth could remember. It was heavy, dark wood, and it held her mother's personal collection, the coats and dresses Norma had made for herself over the years, never sold, never given away. Ruth had decided she'd take the whole thing home on a furniture dolly this weekend, but she wanted to see if there was clearance to move it out through the back door, so she pushed it about 2 feet to the left, and that's when she saw it. A section of the baseboard behind the wardrobe didn't line up the way it should. The boards were a different color, slightly lighter, like they hadn't been exposed to the same decades of dust and shoe scuffs. And when Ruth crouched down and pressed her palm flat against the floor along that section of wall, she felt something she wasn't expecting. A seam. Running in a rough square about 2 feet by 2 feet, she pressed at the corners. Nothing. She ran her fingernail along the edge. Nothing. Then she pushed at the center of the square and felt it give. Just slightly. Just enough. And she went to her mother's toolbox, which was organized better than most toolboxes Ruth had seen in her life, and found a flathead screwdriver and worked it into the seam and lifted. A panel. A perfectly fitted panel cut from the original floorboards, smooth on the underside, sitting in a shallow compartment cut into the subfloor, and in that compartment was a metal box. Not large. About the size of a shoebox, maybe a little wider. Gray-green, painted metal, the kind of thing you'd see at an army surplus store. It had a latch, but no lock. Ruth picked it up. It was heavier than she expected. She sat down on the floor right there, cross-legged like a child with the box in her lap, and she held it for a minute before she opened it. She thought, "Mom, what is this?" Then she opened it. We need to pause here for just a second, because what Ruth found inside that box is going to take a minute to explain, and we want to make sure you understand what it meant. So if you haven't already, subscribe to Giant Stories. We'll be right back to Ruth. On top was a letter, not an envelope, just a single folded piece of paper, the kind from a yellow legal pad covered in her mother's handwriting. Small, precise cursive, the way Norma wrote everything. "Ruth, if you're reading this, then you found it. I always thought you would be the one. Not Gary. You were always the one who went through things carefully. I need to tell you some things I should have told you in person. I tried a few times. I never quite got there. So here it is in writing, which is maybe the coward's way, but at least it's honest. The money in this box is yours, all of it. I kept some of it in cash because I didn't want it traced anywhere, and some of it is in a secondary account I opened in your name at First Heritage Bank on Elm Street. The card and paperwork are underneath the envelope. The total is $94,000. You don't need to explain it to anyone. You don't need to share it with anyone. Gary has already received more from me than you know, and I am not proud of how long I allowed that imbalance to go on. But the money is the smallest thing in this box. The rest, the notebooks, receipts, the little cards, those are the thing I actually need you to see. Look at them carefully. I love you, Ruthie. I always did the best I knew how." Mom Ruth read the letter twice. Then she set it down on the floor beside her and looked at the box. The money was there, a rubber-banded stack of hundreds and fifties at the bottom, more cash than Ruth had held in her hands in her entire life. She set it aside without counting it. Underneath the money was a small envelope with a bank card, and a folded account summary printed on First Heritage letterhead. She looked at the balance, $94,000 just like the letter said, and then set that aside too. And then she pulled out the notebooks. There were 7 of them, small, wire-bound, the kind you buy 3 for $1 at a drugstore. Each one had a year written on the cover in black marker, going back 22 years, one notebook per 2 or 3 years. Ruth opened the first one. The notebooks were a record, not a diary exactly, not financial ledger either, something in between. Page after page in Norma's tight handwriting, names, dates, amounts. But also, and this was the part that made Ruth's hands start to shake, notes, personal notes, a sentence or two about each person. Sometimes more. Carla B. March 2003. 3 kids. Husband walked out in February. Brought in a coat to be mended, didn't have enough to pay, started crying at the counter. Paid her electric bill, $182. She didn't know it was me. Tom H. August 2005. Retired, fixed income, lives alone on Warwick Street. I heard from June Latimer that he'd stopped eating regular. Said it was his stomach, but June thought it was money. Dropped 2 bags of groceries on his porch every Friday for 4 months. Then June said he was okay again. January 2009. 17 years old. Came into the shop with a suit he'd bought at Goodwill for his job interview. Hemmed the pants for free. Told him he looked sharp. He got the job. He came back a month later with a card that said thank you. On and on. 30, 40, 50 entries across the notebooks. Small amounts. A utility bill here, a grocery run there, a child's winter coat, a set of school supplies, a month's medication for someone who couldn't afford the copay. Never large sums. Never announced. Never attached to Norma's name if she could help it. At the back of the last notebook tucked into the inside cover was a folded index card. Ruth opened it. Rule number 1, don't let them thank you. Gratitude changes the equation. It makes it about you. It should be about them. Rule number 2, look at people. Really look. You can usually tell when someone is 3 weeks from the edge. Most people can't. You can. Use that. Rule number 3, the light doesn't have to be bright. It just has to be on. Ruth sat on the floor of her mother's workroom for a long time after that. She called Becca that night from the parking lot of her apartment building because she didn't want to cry in the stairwell. Becca answered on the second ring. She always answered on the second ring. "Mom, you okay?" "I'm okay," Ruth said. I found something today. In the shop." She told her everything. The wardrobe, the panel in the floor, the box, the letter, the notebooks. She read Becca a few of the entries, Carla B. and Danny R., and an older one from 1998 about a woman named Sylvia, whose husband had just been diagnosed, and who Norma had quietly paid 2 months of mortgage for, through an arrangement with the bank that Ruth still didn't fully understand, but which was completely maddeningly like Norma to have arranged. Becca was quiet for a moment after Ruth finished. Then she said, "Mom, did you know any of this?" "Not a word." "She never said anything?" "She never said a word." Becca exhaled slowly. "Grandma was something else." She was said. She did not call Gary that night. She thought about it. She picked up her phone twice and set it back down. Gary was her brother, and she loved him the way you love someone you've shared a childhood with, which is a specific, complicated kind of love that has nothing to do with whether you actually like the person, or trust their judgment, or want them involved in your decisions. The letter had said Gary had already received more than Ruth knew. The next morning, Ruth drove to First Heritage Bank, introduced herself to a woman named Karen at the front desk, and spent 45 minutes establishing access to the account her mother had opened. The balance was exactly $94,227.18. She transferred it to her own primary account and sat in her car in the bank parking lot, and thought about what it meant to no longer be afraid of the first of the month. That afternoon, Gary called her. He'd driven by the shop and seen her car there the day before, he said. Just checking in. Wanted to know if she needed help clearing out the space. Very casual, very Gary. "It's pretty much handled," Ruth said. Good. A pause. "Mom, keep anything valuable in there? Equipment, anything like that?" Ruth looked at the wall in front of her. She kept her voice even. "Just the sewing machines." "I'm going to sell those." "Yeah, right." Another pause. "You know, it might be worth going through the storage real carefully. Mom was the type to, keep things tucked away. I went through everything pretty carefully, Gary." "Right. Of course. Is there something specific you're looking for?" The silence on the other end lasted just a beat too long. No, I want to make sure you're not missing anything." "I'm not missing anything," Ruth said. "I found everything there was to find." She heard him breathe. "Good," he said. Good. They said goodbye, and Ruth set her phone face down on the passenger seat and sat there for a minute. He knew something was there. She didn't know how. Maybe Norma had let something slip, or maybe Gary had gone looking once before and not found it. Or maybe he just knew their mother well enough to suspect. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he hadn't found it, and she had. And the letter had said clearly and without ambiguity that the money was hers and hers alone. She didn't feel guilty. She thought she might, but she didn't. She felt her mother's hand on her shoulder, which was the closest thing to peace she'd had in 14 months. Over the next 2 weeks, Ruth read the notebooks 4 more times. She started to construct a picture of her mother that she hadn't had before. Not because Norma had been hiding who she was, exactly, but because there are parts of people that don't come out in dinner conversations or holiday gatherings, or the ordinary accumulation of years. Parts that only live in what they do when nobody's watching. Norma had been watching. That was the thing. In a town like Millhaven, where you see the same faces at the grocery store, and the post office, and the school pickup line for 30 years, Norma had been watching and noticing and doing something about it, in her quiet, methodical, completely anonymous way. Ruth started making a list of her own. Not of what she'd do differently. Of what she'd do the same. There was a woman in her apartment building, 3rd floor, corner unit, who Ruth had said hello to twice and whose name she didn't know. She'd seen her in the parking lot once at 7 in the morning, struggling to get a stroller down the stairs alone, a baby on one hip, a diaper bag on the other, looking like she was barely keeping it together. Ruth started leaving small things outside her door, a loaf of banana bread, a bag of clementines, a gift card to the grocery store on the corner with no note. She didn't knock. She didn't introduce herself. She just left the things and went back to her apartment. 3 days later, she passed the woman in the mailroom. The woman looked up and smiled, and there was something in the smile that wasn't just politeness. It was lighter somehow, like something had shifted. Ruth thought about her mother's index card. The light doesn't have to be bright, it just has to be on. She went back to the shop one more time before the lease ended. She didn't need to. Everything had been cleared out, the machines sold, the lease paperwork signed over. But she went back on the last day and stood in the empty room that still smelled. Just barely, like fabric softener and Chanel No. 5, and she walked slowly through each section as if she were committing the floor plan to memory. At the back, in the corner where the wardrobe had been, she crouched down and looked at the patch in the floorboards. She'd replaced the panel carefully. No one would know it had ever been opened. She put her palm flat on the floor the way she had that first day, and held it there. "What did you see in people, Mom?" She already knew the answer. Norma had written it down. You can usually tell when someone is 3 weeks from the edge. Most people can't. That was the inheritance. Not the $94,000, though God knows that had changed the arithmetic of Ruth's life in ways she was still processing. The inheritance was the way of looking, the habit of paying attention, the belief, stubborn and quiet and never once announced, that you could matter to someone without them ever knowing your name. Ruth stood up, brushed off her knees, and walked out of the shop for the last time. She locked the door behind her. She stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the sign one last time. Norma's alterations and fine tailoring. She thought about getting the sign repainted, about putting it somewhere in her apartment, about what it would mean to carry your mother's name through the rest of your own life. She thought she'd probably do it, not for sentimentality, just because it was true, and Norma had always believed that true things deserved to be legible. A few months after the shop closed, Ruth got a letter in the mail from a woman named Sylvia Odom in Millhaven. It was handwritten, 2 pages, on stationery that had small blue flowers along the margin. The woman explained that she had been a client of Norma's for many years, her husband's dress shirts, mostly, and that she had only recently learned, through an indirect chain of events she described carefully, that Norma had been the one to arrange payment of her mortgage back in 1998 when her husband was sick, and Sylvia had been, as she put it, 2 weeks from losing the house and not far behind it in my own heart. She wrote, "I never knew who to thank. I'm sorry it took me so long to find you. Your mother was the kind of person that most of us only read about. I hope she knew that. I hope you know that about her." Ruth sat at her kitchen table and read that letter 4 times. Then she got out a piece of stationery. She didn't have any with flowers on the border, just plain cream-colored pages she'd bought at the drugstore, and she wrote Sylvia back. She told her that she didn't think her mother had known, not fully, because people who do things that way usually don't think of themselves as remarkable. She told her about the notebooks. She told her about the index card with the 3 rules. She told her about rule number 3. Sylvia wrote back 10 days later. They started writing to each other regularly after that, real letters on paper through the mail, which was a strange and slow and somehow exactly right kind of connection to have in the year that Ruth was rebuilding her life. "Before we let you go, we want to ask you something. And we're asking honestly because we think about this story a lot. There is probably someone in your life, maybe not even someone you know well, who is right now about 3 weeks from the edge." Norma knew how to spot that. Most of us walk right past it. But you're watching this, which means something in you already understands that the small things matter more than we usually admit. So here's our question for the comments. Who in your life are you keeping a light on for? Even if they don't know it, tell us below. We read every single one. And if you want more stories like Ruth's, stories about what ordinary people are quietly doing for each other when no one's looking to, subscribe to Giant Stories. There are more of these than you think. There are more people like Norma than you think. Ruth Calloway is living proof of that. She still leaves groceries outside her neighbor's door sometimes. The woman's name, it turned out, is Diane. She has a baby girl named Maeve. They have coffee together on Saturday mornings now, which was never the point, but which is the kind of thing that happens when you leave a light on long enough. Norma would have liked that, Ruth thinks. She would have written it down in her notebook, in that small precise cursive, without making a single thing of it. Diane. 3rd floor. New baby. Didn't know anyone in the building. Left a few things at her door. She's okay now, that's all. Just that. Just enough.